Today will be Verity and myself, who are volunteers with Europe Must Act, and your off-screen moderators will be Tilly and Isla, who are also from Europe Must Act. This webinar aims to provide different perspectives on the humanitarian situation on the Aegean Islands. It will by no means be an exhaustive account of the entire situation in the time that we have, but we have some wonderful speakers who will be able to shed some light on the situation. We'll be focusing on two of Europe Must Act's main aims, which are the decongestion of the refugee camps on the Aegean Islands and the call for a new and humane migration policy in Europe. There will be a short Q&A at the end, so please feel free to submit questions either using the Q&A function if you're on the Zoom or by commenting under the Facebook live stream. Some of the Zoom questions might receive a typed answer from our panelists throughout, but others we will try and fit into our Q&A at the end. I'm now going to hand over to our speakers to introduce themselves. So Vera, would you like to start?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to join you guys. My name is Vera Magali Keller. I'm an international lawyer and safe passage advocate. I formerly worked as a legal expert to the UN in New York and for UNHCR at Geneva. I work in refugee protection since 2011, mostly as legal counselor in refugee cases and in different refugee camps. I'm currently a member of the legal team of Sea-Watch, where we legally challenge measures to further outlaw sea rescue in the Mediterranean. I'm also a field international lawyer at Phoenix, which is a local NGO in Lesbos, where we provide legal aid to refugees in Moria refugee camp. And I'm currently quarantining in Lesbos. In my work, I try to have a post-colonial, anti-racist and intersectional approach to refugee protection, and I try to do strategic work to improve the situation for refugees and NGOs as a whole.
Thank you very much, Vera. Robert, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi. My micro is always a bit complicated. I'm Robert. I'm also a lawyer. I'm working for Equal Rights Beyond Borders with offices on Chios, one of the hotspots islands in Athens and in Berlin. We are working on refugee protection and therefore are probably invited and therefore also experts in the field.
Thank you very much. Kirsty, would you like to introduce yourself? Sorry, Kirsty, if you could unmute your mic.
Yes, I'm here representing Kirsty. I'm Kirsty. I'm here representing Europe Must Act as a field and campaigns coordinator. I've spent the last year and a bit in Greece in emergency response, and in some psychosocial response on the mainland as well. Before I started with Europe Must Act and I was here in Greece in emergency response, I got experience at landings, at transit camps, at mainland camps. I've had a small bit of experience in the Balkans. And I'm now based working on projects in an island camp, although in quarantine at the moment. Before this, I've worked for 6 years or so with at-risk and vulnerable communities on human rights issues, emergency response, preparedness, and psychosocial support in Asia.
Thank you, Kirsty. Ibrahim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Ibrahim, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Ibrahim. I came from Africa. I stay in Samos Island, Greece. And also I'm a community representative in Samos Island as a refugee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Erik, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, I'm Erik. I'm a member of the European Parliament focusing on refugees and migrant issues and on development politics. and I was several times on the Aegean island the last years. That's maybe why I also was invited. Yeah.
Thank you, Erik. And Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your Must Act and the aims of the campaign?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for putting this on and for inviting me and everyone here. I'm Jacob from the UK, but I've been working on the Greek Aegean Islands for the last 3 or so years across Chios and Samos primarily. So I direct an NGO, Action for Education, that provides a number of different centres for children and young adults. And I think over those years, almost up to the recent past, there's been a really strong focus on providing kind of direct relief and trying to have an impact on the lives whilst people are here in this acute moment. What happened at the beginning of this year in particular was that following a huge increase in the number of asylum seekers resident on the islands, there was a huge kind of increase in tension, and this led to conflict. And for a short period in February, a lot of the projects and the NGOs were closed following violence between police forces and locals and a whole range of different areas of society. In that moment, we basically launched an initial petition to kind of draw attention to the plight of the thousands and thousands of people living here. And through that, we really wanted to refocus the world's attention on the Aegean Islands, on the situation in Greece. And that's then, since then, kind of just developed a bit organically into a longer term advocacy and campaigning group, Europe Must Act, which maybe because of fueled, I think, a bit by COVID-19, but also boosted a bit by COVID-19, has grown into a really, really big network. And the last few months have seen so many people get on board, help in spreading our network, spreading the word, and culminating to some extent in today and everything that's being organized across Europe. We do have 3 main aims. The first aim is for the immediate decongestion of the islands down to appropriate numbers. There are only meant to be about 6,000 asylum seekers here. There are well over 30,000 on these islands. So this is really our key and first aim. After that, we look for a fairer and more humane migration policy on an EU level, although that does include countries such as the UK and Switzerland taking action in this area too. And finally, I think we want to try and cultivate and bring about just a more welcoming and a nicer context and environment for reception of asylum seekers and refugees into new countries. And that stretches all the way from the Aegean Islands here to kind of northern Scotland. And this is where, you know, we're bringing together so many people to try and change the narrative a bit. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your introductions. Thank you for being here. Okay, so we'll go on to our first focus area, which is the situation on and the decongestion of the Aegean Islands. And our first question is, what is the EU-Turkey deal, briefly, and why has it created such overcrowded camp conditions on the islands? And first of all, we're going to go to Robert.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm trying to answer this briefly. Of course, it's a broad question because it's one of the key instruments of what is called European asylum policy and law to some extent. Because, of course, there are many legal questions occurring from this EU-Turkey deal. To understand what it is, and I'm sure most of the audience will know that the conditions on the islands we are talking about are really bad and in human rights terms unquestionable, violating a lot of human rights provisions. But the question is how this EU-Turkey deal influences the whole situation. And for this, one has to know that this EU-Turkey deal is implemented on 5 islands in the Aegean, and those islands are designated hotspots, European hotspots. This is why the EU in 2015 introduced the so-called hotspot scheme, the hotspot approach. And the idea was in the beginning to register people on the hotspots and then to relocate them to other member states. So hotspots were originally designed as relocation, as registration centers. The game changer was in March 2016, the EU-Turkey deal, because the idea of the EU-Turkey deal is to return all new irregular migrants to Turkey. Turkey is to be considered a safe third country. Of course, legally speaking, there's still an individual examination to be conducted, but the idea is to return all new arrivals. If you want to return people, you have to get a hold of people. That is why the registration centers, which the hotspots, as I said originally, were becoming detention and deportation centers at this time. So before it was allowed to travel to the mainland after registration, now it was not anymore. In the beginning, people were locked up in the so-called hotspots. When the authorities realized, okay, this probably won't be possible within 28 days, the whole idea of returning people, this detention policy was replaced by so-called geographic restriction, meaning people have to stay on the respective island. If someone arrives on Lesbos, for the duration of the asylum procedure, this person is not allowed to leave Lesbos towards the island, towards the Greek mainland anymore. And this creates a situation that we see today with 40,000 people living in space for not even 7,000, for women giving birth in tents, for 80-year-old persons sleeping on the bare ground, because the initial idea of returning people to Turkey is also not working. In the whole 4 years that the EU-Turkey deal is in force now, around 2,000 people returned. This is because of course, several aspects, but also because human rights are still in place. You are not allowed to return people if it would violate human rights. And therefore, the idea of returning people does not work. But at the same time, many people still arrive on the islands. And that is why the camps are overcrowded as they are. Maybe this as an introduction to what the Turkey deal is and why it is actually the root of the conditions we see today on the islands.
Thank you, Robert. That was brilliant. And we'll go to Erik for an EU perspective on this.
Yeah, I also try to be a little bit brief. Maybe we can discuss it later, but in the end, the EU-Turkey deal is just a symptom of a policy where you do not solve problems, but try to push them away from you. That's the EU-Turkey deal. So I think that from an EU perspective, it's also a symptom of EU member states which are not able to find an agreement. So the only thing they agree is deterrence at the external borders. So the situation we see on the Aegean Islands is not like that nobody can solve the problems there, it's just deterrence. So to warn people in bad situations, to send a sign to others that they should better not come. And externalization. So please, be outside of the European Union sign. And that's the EU-Turkey deal from a European perspective. Of course, we can also have a 20 minutes talk what the EU-Turkey deal is, but that's basically, I think, the two things I would also say from a European Parliament perspective. It's a sign of shrinking space for the parliament, because in the end it was some people talk about an EU-Turkey agreement or even a deal, and it's not a deal in the end. It's just a statement, 2 press releases from Turkey and the European Union, and there was no discussion in the parliament about different aspects, instruments, measures. So in the end, we had no say on the EU-Turkey deal, and that's also problematic from a democratic point of view.
Thanks, Erik. Now we'll get to Kirsty, please. Thanks, Kirsty.
Okay, so I guess coming back onto the point made about the geographic restrictions, again, as already explained, this means asylum seekers are kept on their respective islands. However, it's almost more than a freedom of movement restriction and a residency requirement in many ways, because ideologically, you could argue that this is, to some degree, has been implemented to fulfill swifter returns to Turkey, or to enable that more easily. So I think when we think about what that means when people are coming to claim asylum, the perspective should never be on how we can best effectively return them. We should, that's a skewered asylum process from the start. If we look at it from a local perspective, even for locals on the Greek islands, as Jacob already mentioned, we saw frustrations, and we saw aggression at the beginning of this year. It's been on Lesbos for a little longer than it on the other islands, but what this deal has caused is small islands with limited capacities to also be overwhelmed. Of course, the aggression and the frustration shown should never have been taken against camp residents, refugees or asylum seekers who have been forced into what is unworkable, unreasonable, inhumane. But when we look at it from another perspective, in the town in Ngos, where Vial camp is situated, there's around, from the last census, around 900 people. We see with the camp here, there's a 400% increase on that population now. So we also have to consider that what the EU-Turkey deal has done is in fact put far more people at risk than necessary, because NGOs, and ourselves on the ground as well, we're getting threats. And another result of the EU-Turkey deal, from I think the results that we have seen now, is it's actually enhanced and empowered a far-right ideology and opened up an absorption to these messages, which aren't correct.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thank you, everyone, for your answers to that question. It's certainly something that's really difficult to talk about in a brief period of time. Thank you. We'll go to our second question now, which is, what are some of the main problems experienced by inhabitants of the overcrowded camps? We're due to go to Ibrahim first, but he might be having some trouble hearing us. Ibrahim, can you hear us, or should we come back to you? We'll come back. So we'll go to Jacob first.
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear us?
We can hear and talk. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's hear from Ibrahim.
Okay, and as I'm talking to you, I stay in Samos Island, and some of the problems in the highland so challenging. You know, as I'm talking to you now, I'm the community representative in my community, and now we have a big problems in the highland. Although, like my situation here now in Samos, they don't allow refugee to come in, or immigrant, whatever, in Samos Island for now. So it's like the Coast Guard, people, when they are guiding the sea, so if they have some of the people that they will take them to the various camp, like the Moria or the Kios. But for now, in Samos, we don't have that people that are coming in presently. But again, the situation of living in Samos, as for now, as I'm talking to you, is not good for us, because we only have like one hospital. So even somebody have attack in the night or in the day, anytime, so the problem is too much. They cannot take you immediately to take you to the hospital, unless maybe when they call ambulance will take something like 5 hours, 4 hours before they take you to the hospital. You know, it's so pathetic. And even when we went to go and collect food again, you can take like something like 2 hours, 3 hours to collect food. You want to see doctor, you can take something like 2 hours, 3 hours. You know, it's so pathetic. But we just pray so that this program that you people are trying to advocate, you know, it's going to benefit for we, the refugees. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ibrahim. And next, we're going to go to Jacob, please.
Yeah, I mean, when you start to try and get your head around just what it's like on the islands, I mean, you can take any part of your own life and try and make some comparisons. You can look at education, you look at health, you can look at shelter, rights to kind of really basic legal services that you might need. These issues are in a sense really well documented. I mean, they exist across different social media. They exist in more lengthy reports. There is a bit of a general kind of crisis of engagement or a crisis of empathy, which is really difficult to get past. I mentioned now there's a series of videos actually on the Europe Must Act website called Raising Voices, which does paint a really maybe clearer and more personal picture of what the conditions are like. I mean, over the last years, I think I've just had so many instances where you are horrified at the stories that you hear. And there's general systematic issues around kind of food lines, as Ibrahim kind of mentioned, that you're waiting really for hours at all points in the day to really just get a very simple kind of airplane food styled package, which is kind of bland and extremely repetitive. And you take just that one example and you can start to look at, I guess, look a bit intersectionally at who's affected. So then if you move on from something like food to education, there are lots of NGOs and there are lots of services that may be trying to provide some safe spaces, some welcoming kind of respite or alternatives. But you go back to the food issue, and for example, for women and for girls, it might be that they are having to spend a lot more time waiting in those food lines and simply can't then access the other services. So there's kind of compounded issues that affect every different group. There are just horrible individual stories of people who are waiting years and years for just a simple answer to their application, whether positive or negative. And after all that time, that answer maybe does come back as negative, or it comes back as positive. And you really question, how there can be a system which is just stealing from so many people for so long in these conditions. But it's something you really have to actively go out and try and find and try and understand. And final thing I would say is that nothing has radically changed. There's no reason this conversation is happening right now versus a year ago. Maybe there are more people on the islands. But I think COVID-19 has, and that kind of it's a big topic, and it's a big theme, and it was a big threat, and it remains a threat to the camps and the overcrowded conditions. But what I think is good for people to really start to understand this is to try and understand and use the language that COVID-19 has given us, in a sense, this language of isolation, the language of having kind of social distance, of having to stay stuck in a place. And it's always incomparable. One can't compare one's personal lockdown in a nice house to what that might look like in a camp. But I think the way that we've started having these conversations does give a bit of a way into thinking more about this.
Thank you, Jacob. And next, we're going to go to Vera, please. Thanks, Vera.
So yeah, I would like to talk about the legal situation, maybe a little general. The rights of asylum seekers that they have if they reach the European Union is to live under decent living conditions, have access to emergency healthcare, psychosocial support. Vulnerable refugees have the right to receive special care and have access to legal advice. All of those rights are currently not protected. We have horrendous living conditions in Moria that have been mentioned already. We have basically no access or really limited access to state provided emergency healthcare, no psychosocial support. The vulnerability of refugees or asylum seekers is assessed generally through a medical examination. And this relevant office went on strike several times. And during those times, there were no medical screenings possible. What Jacob already mentioned is also the wait times for asylum applications is currently between 6 months and 1 year, why they have the red stamp that had been mentioned already before. So it means that people are geographically restricted to the camp or to the island and can't leave. And now during Corona, people were even restricted to the camp. Those long wait times are in shocking discrepancy to short deadlines for appeals. For example, in cases of rejection of an application, asylum seekers only have 5 days to lodge an appeal, which is currently especially critical since asylum seekers face problems finding free legal aid, especially during lockdown, since people can't leave the camps and NGOs are at their capacities. Also, the interviews that asylum seekers have to go through, they are an integral part of asylum application and normally require good preparation. And this good preparation is currently not provided since NGOs are at limit, since the camps are so overcrowded. We also have the general problems that we have in the EU. They also exist on Lesbos, which is that decision takers in the EU asylum system normally don't have enough knowledge about the countries of origin. The interviewers are generally not trained enough or sensitized to work with traumatized persons. And also we have an incomplete protection of vulnerable groups, especially LGBTIQ people and women, since in the past, gay cis men were given renounced international protection since the courts found that they could return and live decently, which translates to having to suppress their sexuality as an inherent part of themselves. And women and other victims of gender-based violence were told to accept being returned to patriarchal surroundings and search for male assistance. So overall, from a legal side, I would say we have an unacceptable situation in the camps where refugees and asylum seekers are stripped of their basic rights.
Thanks, Vera. Thanks everyone for your insights on that question. So now our third question, we'll move on to broadly, why do we need to decongest the island? So this speaks to one of Europe Must Act's main aims. And we're going to go to Jacob for this first, please. Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah, well, I mean, why should we put all this work? Why should we try and change the situation here? I guess I can start by maybe just identifying 3 groups of people who are adversely affected by this, and I think that lends to that question of why. First and foremost, obviously, just for asylum seekers and refugees actually here, this isn't the way any nation or group of nations should deal with like migrant flows that have existed for a long time and will exist for a long time in the future. We've just really covered the situation. That speaks for itself, I think, in why there is a real urgency to decongest. It's not about emptying necessarily completely the islands and then imagining that no one's going to arrive. This, in a sense, this door will be open. So first and foremost, just for the people suffering and living here. But I do think, secondly, for the local communities in Greece, and Kirsty picked up on it earlier, there is just an awful amount of kind of stress and tension and very kind of chronic kind of social depression, I think it might be called that, that's come about from having such a big increase to the population whilst coming out themselves from kind of a couple of decades of greater social hardship, and also as islands here. I mean, if you look at a map of Greece, there's the mainland of Greece, and then these islands are right next to the coast of Turkey. They're actually a long way from Athens or the mainland. There's a long-standing sense that the Athens or the center of the Greek government has to some extent neglected the islands in key infrastructure that includes kind of the hospitals and the schools, and that is just really compounded by this extra burden that these societies are having to cope with and deal with, and I think they also, from a local community side, they see the sheer volumes of European money that's being pumped into the services here, and one, they're not necessarily seeing the results, and two, that people feel that it's, as also Erik said, that we're not trying to find a solution to this issue. We're just creating a very hostile border, and we're trying to deter people from coming. So I think for local communities, this is a real priority. I think finally and thirdly, I think for all of us, I think there's a real reason why we should decongest. I think for many of us here, we have a set of values that do not align with how the situation is being played out here. And I think many of us are engaged in trying to represent those values and those ethics on a wider European level. And I think this is really powerful. And this is also at the heart of this Europe Must Act movement. It's a social movement. And we start with that social movement to drive change on a political and an advocacy level. But it really starts with just people. It starts with kind of groups, and then you move to voters, and you start to influence the voices who are representing yourselves in different parliaments. So I think if this is a situation, and if these kind of abuses to human rights are something that you don't agree with, then you have the responsibility to engage, and from that responsibility, hopefully the motivation to do as much as you can. Thanks.
Great, Jacob, thank you. And can we hear from Erik on this as well, please?
Yeah, I can basically agree with what Jacob said, but very briefly, I think maybe the question is also like, why should we find arguments for decongestion or evacuation or whatever? So is it not like the others who should argue why they restrict the movement of people so much and why they accept that situation? So I'm basically answered this question many times, but in the end, I think it's maybe not us to find arguments for treating people with dignity, then the others who should maybe be a little bit more under pressure when they create and accept situations where, of course, you cannot find a dignified perspective or whatever if you have a refugee camp with a capacity like Moria 2,757, and then there are more than the capacity. So that should have a consequence, and from politicians who are in power or in responsibility for the situations, but it doesn't at the moment. So I think it's also about us to create more pressure on the others and not only talking about arguments for ourselves.
Thanks, Erik.
Thank you for your responses in that focus area. We are now going to move on from talking about decongestion to talking about European migration policy a little more broadly, and why Europe Must Act is calling for a new and humane migration policy. So our first question is, what are the problems with the current migration policy? So I would like to go to Vera to talk about this first, please.
Yes, I think one of the biggest problems we're facing, I mean, we have many, but one that is currently discussed is the pushbacks that are happening in the Aegean Sea. So let me explain what pushbacks are. Pushbacks are state measures where refugees or migrants are repatriated, which means forced back to the country they enter from, usually immediately after crossing the border, without the possibility of filing an asylum application. Pushbacks violate the European Convention of Human Rights, ban on collective expulsion. Ban on collective expulsion means that refugees can only be forced to leave a country after a reasonable and objective examination of the particular case. In violation of these principles, people are collectively pushed back at sea and on land, because the Hellenic Coast Guards currently pushes refugee boats back into Turkish waters, and officials force asylum seekers back to the Turkish side of the Evros River. I want to stress that pushbacks at sea and on Evros border are not a new phenomenon. Before Syriza became governing party in 2015, there were a lot of pushbacks, and the Aegean Sea was almost a lawless space, since there were no civilian actors and human rights NGOs at that time. But due to the change of government, but also because migrants started filming and publishing the acts of the Hellenic Coast Guards, there were less pushbacks after 2015. Now, after signing the EU-Turkey deal in 2016, Turkey started to pull back refugees. And since the beginning of 2019, pushbacks by the Greek Coast Guards became the norm again. And now, since Turkey declared it will not follow the EU-Turkey deal anymore, we see a shocking escalation at the Greek-Turkish border. In March, live shots were fired at asylum seekers. 2 asylum seekers were killed, and new tactics of pulling asylum seekers on life rafts without paddles and let them drift in the water emerged. NGOs report of at least 900 asylum seekers that were pushed back this year alone. And the number might be a lot higher since Mare Liberum, for example, a German NGO that does amazing work in the monitoring of human rights abuses in the Aegean Sea, is currently not able to operate because Germany changed the law to hinder humanitarian missions in the Mediterranean. This week, and this is a new method, an international research team, including Lighthouse Reports and Bellingcat, also published an article about several illegal pushbacks by Greek authorities on land and sea. One of them is pushbacks from Samos, where refugees reached Samos on their own. So they reached the land, police arrested them, confiscated their phones, and pushed them back onto boats, and finally onto a life raft without motor or paddle. And the raft was then pulled back into Turkish water. There were also pushbacks at land where people already reached Diavata, which is a refugee camp close to Thessaloniki. And the police used the pretext of wanting to check their paper and took their personal belongings and also the mobile phone, loaded them in the back of a truck, brought them to Evros River, and loaded them on a rubber boat and brought them back to the Turkish side. The Greek authorities currently seem to target especially young males from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Northern Africa. And as I've stated before, these tactics violate the Greek constitution, EU law and directives, and customary international law. However, they seem to be tolerated by the EU as they serve to prevent more people from crossing the Aegean or the Evros River towards Europe or towards the EU, which is something Erik also mentioned before.
Thank you very much for your response there, Vera. Kirsty, would you like to add some further insights on this?
Why do we need a new and humane policy? I think on basically on a very, very human level, if you've ever had to help a baby off a dinghy that is not worthy for the sea, if you've ever had to give a woman maternity clothes because otherwise she won't have them when she's heavily pregnant, if you've ever had a question about violence caused at sea by potentially by authorities, then you know that this situation is not right. So what we see right now is not right or fair. But we can't just focus on this, we have to look at what we can do. So why do we need and why are we pushing for a new and humane policy? Because we know that there are voices all around Europe that do not agree with this, and we've seen this through our city chapters. We are looking, with Europe Must Act, we look at citizens' perspectives and perceptions. We want to understand why false claims have been allowed to be made. Then we want to look at the counter narratives that we can produce. And as we're doing that, we are seeing discussion raised, we're seeing voices raised, and we're seeing people's minds change. We know that there's an overwhelming number of people in Europe who would be appalled if they understood what was happening here. And at Parliament level, things were very close. I remember, I think it was last year, looking at search and rescue operations, and there was a vote there. It was incredibly close. So part of what we have to do is if we know that there is an option to move to something better and that there is willingness behind it, as Jacob said, there's a responsibility on us to act. So fundamentally, as a continent of people, we should be working together. We should be collectively kind to provide opportunity, not degrade livelihoods. We should never allow for punishment of people who are fleeing devastating situations when all they want is something better or something safer. So we together, all as humans, have a duty to one another, and Europe Must Act sees that we cannot criticize if we do not try to also find an answer. So what we are and why we're pushing for a new humane policy is because we are a collective problem-solving group of people from all different backgrounds. And what we are doing is putting people over politics. And politics led to the EU-Turkey deal. And that's why we wanted to change, because the situation is not fair, right, or humane.
Thank you very much for that very inspiring response, Kirsty. If we could move to Robert for your insights, please.
Yeah, well, so I'm neither a politician nor a political scientist, but the problem towards or regarding European asylum policy is that there is obviously no European asylum policy at the moment that deserves the name European and asylum policy, both. It's one of the few fields where the European Union has a competency to really act. And the last legal package that was actually introduced was in 2013. That is incredibly long ago. And there were many, many efforts to reform the common European asylum system, but many, many efforts also failed reforming the system. And this led to a situation of a vacuum where every member state is trying to do what is best for the respective member state. This leads not only in Greece, but in other member states as well, to a situation where the states try not to be responsible for refugees. I mean, this was anyway the idea of the Dublin system, but the Dublin system also has some humanitarian mechanisms. It has some family bounds to be taken into account, and so on and so on. But now, at the moment, the policy of every member state is not to be responsible. And this vacuum is also filled, especially in the last month. So Vera talked about what happened in February and March by deterrence and by obvious human rights violations. And not only human rights violations, but also international refugee law violations. And this is so obvious. The submission of asylum applications was suspended. We have the violent pushbacks. We have the killings. We have children in detention. We have all this phenomena. And everybody, literally everybody knows it's illegal. It's not a legal question. It's not complicated to assess. And it's still implemented. And this is the new quality of what we are facing at the moment, I would say, because in February and March, there was a red line crossed when the European Union representatives, Ursula von der Leyen, flew in to Greece and said, we are happy to have Greece here being the shield of Europe. Still, it was well known that they are obviously pushing back people, that they are shooting with live ammunition at the border, and that they only introduce deterrent measures. And this is because everybody knows nothing happens. I mean, we can legally address it on an individual level. We represent many, many persons. We win many cases in front of the European Court of Human Rights, and it's still introduced on a structural basis. And this is the point at the moment, that there is no common European asylum policy, and that every member state is trying to do what is best for the member state. And this, at the moment, is what is worse for the person concerned, for the protection seeker.
Thank you very much, Robert. Erik, would you like to give your insights on this, please?
Yes, we have a nice concept on like what should we change on the European asylum system. It's on my website, so I will not say everything now because it's 8 pages or something, and we try to be very short, so it's like too long for a webinar. But I would say if I focus on some points, some were also mentioned, so I can say it briefly. I think the first entry criteria. So if people come to Europe, the member state where they are first is responsible for the whole asylum procedure. That's a big problem because that does not create a European responsibility, but a member state responsibility, and everybody's trying to shift that responsibility to someone else. In Greece, we see that they shift the responsibility even to life rafts at sea, where they just put people and see if the wind is bringing them back maybe to Turkey. So wind is responsible, not the government. And that is also one of the main problems, which was also mentioned, and in the end, not with the word, but the word is, I would say, non-compliance. So that's especially for us as a lawmaker, the European Parliament, a big problem, because in the end, a new European asylum system would be new laws. Yeah, it's not like a system in the end. It's yeah, laws. And if we understand that we already have some laws, but nobody is caring about the law at the moment, and it does not have even consequences if you break the law and break the arm of a refugee or whatever, and then it's a big problem for lawmakers, because why should we make new laws in the end? So non-compliance is also a really big problem for us. So we try to increase our scrutiny, transparency as a parliament, and also we are trying to create more pressure on the European Commission. And the third big problem is that the political debate is not based on real problems and challenges, and the whole discussion about asylum, migration is not really based on the reality. It's just a discussion which is far away from the real challenges at the moment, and that's also a big problem. And that's why I think it's very good what, for example, Youth Must Act or Sea-Watch are doing at the moment. It's not only the work on the ground, which is important, and that's reality, but it's also about bringing the reality to somebody else, because in the end we recognize that many people have completely stupid but also far from reality opinions on asylum and migration, and everybody has a feeling about it, but not so many people know what really happens on the ground, and that's something we also must change.
If I may add one thing on this and what I said, the system that was introduced in 2013 raised and increased the protection standard incredibly. So in every member state, not only in Greece, but also in Germany, it was much worse before. So what we have is quite an achievement that has to somehow be held on this level. And this is actually the challenge. And the problem, as Erik said, is non-compliance. So we have a protection crisis and we have a rule of law crisis, obviously, because no one is sticking to the law anymore, which is not too bad. So there are, of course, some problems. First entry principle is a big point, but the whole system could work if there would be compliance. So this is a big issue. And sorry for taking too much time.
No, it's I also wanted to say one sentence, because it's not about, like, we don't need a new system or a fresh system, as the European Commission said, a fresh start on migration. What we need is a better system, but there are also high chances that the ideas member states have at the moment, the European Commission has for the future, are not creating a better system, but maybe a system where the things they do now are not even against the law anymore. So that's also one thing we should keep in mind, that in the end we have a system at the moment, and there are high chances that it's more about defending the laws we have than changing them in the ways the member states want to change them.
Thank you both for adding that, and thank you everyone for answering that question. So moving on with what the problems are with the current migration system, we would like to ask what could a more humane migration policy look like looking ahead. So I'd like Jacob to start, and then I'll go to all the other panelists to make a contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on this, I don't personally want to say that much, because and actually, on a personal level, this is neither my field of expertise, and I think importantly also not our responsibility completely. I mean, there are other people here who have much more expertise, and Erik's already started to outline what could be different. But we don't have to necessarily be approaching policymakers with the solution. This is, at the end of the day, their job. And what Robert brought up around, maybe Erik, around not evidencing or basing new policy in proper backing and not having an informed conversation is really frustrating, because there have been letters, there have been clear indications that researchers who have spent time here on the ground, who really understand in depth what the issues are and how you could go about kind of solving some of them, also don't seem to be being heard. We spoke once with the commissioner responsible for developing this, so say, new pact, and even then she was very, very clear, and this echoes what Erik's saying, that anyway, this new deal, whatever that might look like, is going to be a compromise. She is basically mixing together the various national policies of different member states, and the outcome of that is unlikely to be revolutionary or particularly beneficial. And I think that's well, that's worrying, and I hope it doesn't end up that it does just become a way to justify an almost decrease in the laws upholding kind of basic rights. I mean, simply there should be things like more effective burden sharing, and I echo this point that at a point of arrival there should be a much quicker, in a sense, relocation process where the entire asylum application can be held. It's not a necessary reason why so many people should be held on islands. I think one clear action that could be taken is that there could be less stigmatization of refugees by governments and also of kind of the NGOs supporting them. I think this creates a very, very hostile culture. It kind of feeds back into the, I guess, the larger EU narrative. And I think also, you know, one example where the EU has really mobilized on a continental level is with an agency such as Frontex, which is highly present in these, especially in these external places, but the hotspot islands as one example. There should be a similar system, I believe, set up to provide other basic rights. So there should be a Frontex for doctors, a Frontex for teachers or psychologists that can effectively mobilize the human resources which we have across the European Union to places within Europe's borders where that's most critically needed. And from what I understand, there have been some talks around this, but you know, yet even now, kind of nothing really material has come out of it. So these are some ideas, but I will defer on this to some of our other panelists.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Vera, you mentioned in your work that you like to take an intersectional and post-colonial anti-racist approach. Would you be able to talk about that in relation to what you'd like to see in the future of refugee protection in Europe?
Yes, I think foremost, it is really important that we see the tendencies that are happening now. I mean, all of us are really busy on the ground, and sometimes it's hard to keep an eye on the bigger picture. But I think we can see clear tendencies that are happening. One of them is the complete and deliberate disregard of international public law and the human rights of asylum seekers on EU's outer borders, which comes back to the rule of law crisis that Erik and Robert mentioned. It really looks like the EU wants to turn borders so dangerous that it prevents people from coming. And also, if people survive their journey to Europe, they want to put them into camps that are so undignifying that even people fleeing conflict will think twice if they really want to take the risk to come to Europe. I think if we want to fight this, we have to address the root causes of this problem. I think one of them is racism. I don't think that if it was 20,000 white European lives that were lost at sea, I think we wouldn't have to wait for more than 7 years for the EU to establish effective sea rescue measures, which they did not establish yet. Because you mentioned the post-colonialist approach, I think we also have to realize how we, by the way we live and consume, contribute to people having to leave their home. And what I try to advocate for is a more feminist approach, which would mean to empower refugees to be able to navigate their own future and pay special account to women, LGBTIQ refugees and vulnerable groups, and also amplify the voices of refugees. But I think first and foremost, and everyone can do this, is that we have to realize that refugees don't owe us anything, but we owe them everything, because when a refugee crosses a border, they're using their basic right to asylum, and nobody has the right to strip them of any rights that are enshrined in the Geneva Convention, in EU law, or in European national laws.
Thank you very much for that, Vera. Erik, could you talk a little bit, I think you touched on it a little bit before, but what changes are practical and achievable?
Practical and achievable. So I think, like, yeah, let us not, like, at the moment, the majorities are a little bit complicated, but we can change that, and that's a solution in the end. And what I think, as I said, we can talk about hours about European asylum system, but I think one really great approach is the approach from the German Seebrücke, but also from Europe Must Act on a European level to focus a little bit on local and regional authorities, because our discussion is basically that some governments of member states say, like, no, we don't want refugees, and we don't want that, and we don't want that. But in the end, it's not a situation in Europe that nobody wants human rights or dignified living conditions for everyone. The situation is that we have many local and regional authorities, cities, regions, German Bundesländer, that are willing to welcome refugees in the end, and we should find more incentives for other regions to welcome refugees. So let us not only talk about coercion for Hungary. I think in the end, it's also a discussion in the long-term perspective, how we can convince member states to participate in European solidarity. But maybe the first step is that we organize that local and regional authorities, that cities can welcome refugees, that they have the basis in the law to do that from a European asylum system, and that they are also getting funded for their solidarity in the end, because that creates incentives. That's one approach. And I think what Jacob said, to create more European responsibility, also an example for asylum procedures, will create better procedures, hopefully, in the end. So I'm really also like the approach from, for example, EASO, the European Asylum Support Office, to create agency out of it. It's not a real agency like Frontex yet, but in the end, what we recognize is that it's sometimes, of course, we have some problems with Frontex, but in the end, it's easier to organize transparency, scrutiny in Frontex missions than in national Coast Guard actions. And that's also one of the problems now, that on most of the borders where pushbacks happen, Frontex is not as present as you maybe wish them to be present, because then it's easier to have consequences for that actions. That's the thing. And of course, we need to have a system with European responsibility, where we have enough capacity to have efficient and human rights-based procedures. So at the moment, people try to speed up the process a lot. So what everybody's talking about now is border procedures and having decisions after 4 weeks and all the things. And I don't think that it's possible to have a decision after 4 weeks, but of course it's possible to speed up the process and do not limit the rights of the people, but the timing, for example, how long people should be on the islands. And that's also one of the many points we should talk about.
Thank you very much, Erik. Robert, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, maybe I would echo. I learned this word now recently by Jacob. I always said copy. I think it's wrong. So I want to echo what Jacob and Erik said regarding relocation and regarding fair share of responsibilities. A fair share, of course, for member states, but the fair share has also to be realized with regard to the human being. So what is fair? Family bindings and so on have to be taken into account in this whole process. The point is, and the actual question is, how does this fair share work? And there we raised the question of the procedures that actually establish the member state that is responsible in accordance with the principle of fair share. And this have to be procedures, and many people advocate for border procedures. And when we talk legally about the reform of the European asylum system. We have not only to take into account what is legally possible, so maybe border procedures might be legally possible to a certain extent, but they create an environment where it is most likely that basic rights, human rights, fundamental rights are violated. So having border procedures will lead to a situation we have now with the EU-Turkey deal, most likely. And regarding the EU-Turkey deal situation, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, an agency of the EU, already said in 2016, the hotspot approach is deemed to fail with regard to human rights protection. And every approach that is echoing this, this border procedures again will lead to a situation that we have now, because it is not working, this speeded up procedures. And this is not only for human rights violations in the basic core, so meaning provision of inhumane and degrading treatment, but it's also with regard to legal protection, which is a fundamental principle of the rule of law, with regard to an effective remedy. So how can I assess an effective remedy? Because this is the core principle of the rule of law, being able to have my decision actually reviewed by a court. And this, in a situation where 40,000 people live in a space for 7,000, is always the biggest problem, because of course they can't be represented and so on and so on. So this will create problems in this regard. And I know my time is nearly up, but I saved some time earlier, so let me add one thing. This whole idea of the EU being more responsible also for the procedures is, from my perspective, a really important one, because we have a common European asylum system, but still we have the asylum law implemented differently in every member state. We have different recognition rates. Recognition rates meaning, is a person recognized as a refugee or as a beneficiary of international protection or not? Germany has a really low recognition rate for Afghans. Sweden has a really low recognition rate for Afghans. France has a high recognition rate for Afghans. How does this fit? So this is a problem, obviously, also. Having a European agency doing these assessments would probably at least lead to a more comprehensive approach. And secondly, a European responsibility on this issue would erase one of the biggest questions for me, which is accountability. Because from a lawyer's perspective, it's the most frustrating thing that you see human rights violations, you see it happen, and you can't help the agency, the authorities accountable. So regarding the hotspots, we have the EU saying, okay, we give Greece money, they implement our approach, but Greece is responsible for what is happening on the ground. Greece says, we are implementing what is happening on the ground, but we are only implementing a European project. So we are not responsible either. And so we have really problems to address human rights violations to the competent authority, because it's just every time slipping. So 3 points for a reform of the system. One is no border procedures, because this will lead to human rights violations. Second is Europeanization, if this is a word. And third is the accountability issue has to be solved. We have to address responsibilities and have to enforce it legally, and have to get authorities that violate human rights to court.
Thank you, Robert. Kirsty, would you like to add anything else to this?
Yeah, so to echo Jacob, I'm not also an expert, but the thoughts I've had have actually been brought up again. So looking at accountability and transparent reporting, actually, I know that the monitoring of relations and powers actually at the authority level is not done well, because I know NGOs who've been removed from camps because they've spoken out against something that shouldn't have been happening. In the current situation with coronavirus, we know discretionary fines are being given. You know, one police officer may not see something as a fine, an act that can be fined, another will. So this is a discretionary power, and also to some level an abuse of power. So if for example, if an NGO sees this happening, we also feel silenced and unable to speak out, because we know long term we might be removed from our projects, and that is that's a far worse outcome than than in our minds in that moment than speaking out in the moment. So there has to be some level of accountability and some sort of transparent reporting, both for refugees and asylum seekers on camp, because many of them are afraid to speak out as well. And also for volunteers and NGOs who have direct relations with authorities. That for me is really, really a big issue. And that also then can more widely look at why is this not being discussed more? And it's not being discussed more because people don't feel that they can discuss it more. And yeah, and of course on the fact that internationally as a European community we are failing to take our fair share of displaced people. That would be my main point.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. And Ibrahim, what changes would you like to see in terms of how Europe treats refugees?
The EU and the Turkish government has a deal. And when you look at the total population in Turkey, it's like 3 million population or so. And when you look at the total population in Greece, both the mainland and the island, I think is 2 million something population, according to my understanding. And which is good deal, because if now they allow people, the refugees that are in Turkey, they allow them to come to Greece as they are now, it's going to be a burden to the EU, right? And when you come, eventually, because we have 2 exits to come to Greece, you can pass through the mainland and you can pass through the water also, you know. So when you come, like as I'm talking to you, I passed through the water. And when you came to Greece, they will take you to the camp. You stay there for some times. You start your process, and I look at that. The process is very slow. You know, like I'm spending almost 1 year, 4 months now as I'm talking to you. My interview, I never did my interview as I'm talking to you now. And I have some of my colleagues, like the new law, I think it's 2019. So when they came, they're supposed to do their process, they finish their interview, and maybe you have your results, which is negative or positive or so. And as for me, as I'm talking to now, the process in the asylum seeker is very slow, and the EU must act on this. It's very, very slow. I have some of my colleagues here as I'm talking to you now. They spend something like 2 years, 1 month, no interview. No interview as I'm talking to you now. I have some of my friends, and also concerning about the lawyer issue, like when somebody have a reject, you know, we only have one private lawyer here, which is so, you know, it have so burden. You know, like I have some of my friends 2 days ago, they reject them. So we came to the lawyer, we discussed issue. He say he cannot able to apply for them. So they are just sitting, nothing happened for them. So I believe also if the EU will act on this to facilitate this asylum issue, it will be more faster. It's going to help with the refugees. Because now we have some of the NGO like the Metatracy, advocate lawyers, we have the GCR as I'm talking to you now. They are all advocates and they are all busy. And some of you, when you have a reject, we think at that, oh, I'm not going to advocate lawyer, I'll find a private lawyer, you know, which is good. You find a private lawyer, you pay some amount of money, and the lawyer will apply for you also. You know, when he apply for you, you can also sit and wait for your decision. And as I'm talking to you, it was yesterday, one of my neighbor, she's a lady. She's pregnant, about 6 or 7 months pregnant. He went to go and renew his house vice. You know, I think he have already finished the interview before, but he went there to go and renew his house vice. So they give him positive results. So when he came very close to me, he fell on the ground. Unless I felt very hard to meet some of the police, they took him to the hospital, and up to now, as I'm talking to you, she's in the hospital. So I also want to plead to the EU. They should be immediate, in fact, they should help the refugees to facilitate the asylum issues. It's very, very slow. The asylum issue is very, very slow. It's very, very slow in the island. So please, please, this program, I'm so excited to be in this program today because I believe I can able to express myself a little bit, although my English is not too much fluent, but I hope you people can, you know, we can understand a little bit better. So please, please, should act on this, please. So this is my concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. That was a very clear message. And yes, very inspiring, I'm sure, for our audience. So now we're going to go on to taking some audience questions.
Hi, so we've had loads of questions in, so thank you everyone at home. And Ibrahim, your English is perfect, so thank you. Okay, so we'll try and get through as many of the Q&A questions as possible. The first one is, what are the lockdown restrictions on the islands, and what does this mean for refugees and NGOs? And I think first, if we could hear from Ibrahim on this.
Once more again.
On any insight into the lockdown restrictions on the islands?
Well, the restrictions is good because I believe we are preventing ourselves and they also prevented us. And now, even when we go to the supermarket before, although I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, I think so, they have already taken another step again to, we're supposed to be finished with the restriction now. But I think yesterday the mayor or the one in charge with the asylum, so we take another issue to increase the restrictions in the highland, especially in Samos, because when we are going to the supermarket, this is going to be like a 1 meter with your friend or whatever. It is good because since when this COVID-19 started, we don't have no cases in Samos Island, which is fantastic. And because if we have any cases, it's going to affect us. And we all know that COVID-19 is not easy. Everybody know that it's not a good disease, but like the distance, we still taking the measures. You know, it's now as I'm talking to you at least 7 o'clock. You should not come to the city again. You should be in your tent, wherever. You stay there for a time till the morning hour. We continue our process again. So it's good anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And actually, in response to that, someone has asked, have there been protests or any other response in the camps about COVID-19 or the restrictive measures that are in place? Perhaps someone who is on the islands right now would like to take that.
I'm happy to input on that. I mean, Ibrahim, I don't know if you've actually seen protests inside the camp. I mean, one of the big challenges is that the information access into camps at the moment is so much harder than has been. I think it's on Lesbos there have been more protests, on Chios and Samos less so. And I also know on some of the other islands there were protests, but you know, these lockdown measures are coming at the same time as a massive increase in the number of decisions being made on asylum cases, and that, you know, that has this it's kind of intent. Yeah, it's completely connected with how safe people feel to demonstrate other connected rights. So I think it was on Leros, another island, where there were actually some significant protests, but as soon as the these negative decisions came out, the protests more or less stopped, because people are very afraid that by speaking up, this can affect their asylum, and indeed it actually genuinely can right now. I mean, there was a new national law on how asylum applications are managed at the borders that came into effect earlier this year, and the result of that makes it far easier for the Greek authorities to deem an asylum seeker is not complying with the system, and non-compliance means kind of fast-tracking your application. So there are real reasons why people would be afraid to do this.
If I may, sorry, no, you.
No, I was just going to sort of reiterate that from my face experiences, that people are actually more afraid, especially right at the onset of coronavirus, when very, very little was known about it. People are less protesting and more afraid for their health, in fact, rather than protesting for their own health rights. And there's a lot of fear around the implication that a fine or that speaking out for your own rights might have on your asylum claim and the process there.
If I may add one thing on the measures taken, also it concerns the last question that we may be left behind already, but the point is that the idea to treat or to deal with COVID-19 was to deal with it in the camps. So the camps were basically sealed when the lockdown was. So people were not allowed to leave it, and the information spreading inside was really bad. So there was no official information on how to proceed with this virus. People were not allowed to go to the hospital, and all these issues were kept in the camp. Of course, in camp, social distancing and all the issues that appear or appeared within the corona crisis everywhere else are impossible. We heard that people spend their life in queues, queuing up for breakfast, queuing up for food, queuing up for doctor's appointment, queuing up for clothes. And now they were also queuing up for soap and other hygienic items. So actually within the corona crisis, the gathering of people actually increased even. So this may be to have an idea of how the virus was managed, so-called, in the camp. So we were representing many people that were still living there and obviously belonging to the risk group. And we won all these cases in the European Court of Human Rights. But again, this is only actually one person concerned then in the end. But there was no evacuation, and that actually not a big outbreak happened, seems to me from what people know about the virus to be a big surprise. However, on Chios maybe, and this regarding the protest, there was one woman dying in isolation. Nobody knows if from COVID, with COVID or whatever. But after this, there was a big protest. The information point was burned. This was in April. But this was not directly related to the COVID restrictions, but directly related to that people didn't know actually what would happen. So this was directly related to the information spreading.
Thank you very much for that, Robert.
Thank you. These are some really interesting answers. Thank you so much. Our next question, it's a really interesting one, so thank you to whoever asked this. The question is, how can we capitalize on the shift of perspective in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how do we prevent return to previous views of refugees? And I think first we'll go to Vera, because I know that an anti-racist approach is really fundamental to your work, and then we'll try and go to a couple more people.
Yes, I'm very happy to see how the Black Lives Matter movement got or was taken on inside the EU, because it would have been possible to just say, yeah, that's a problem in the United States, and we don't have the same problems here. But of course, we do have the same problems here, and I'm happy to see that many, especially young people, young white people also joined the movements and demonstrated. So I think we have a momentum here where we have to question, or that we have to use, and we have to question how much racism we have in our societies and how much people from different backgrounds suffer from those systems. And I think one of the systems where this leads to deaths and suffering of humans is the asylum system. And as I mentioned before, I think the fact that we have more than 20,000 people lives that were lost in the Mediterranean without anyone or without an EU reaction to it. And Frontex, in my opinion, is not a reaction to it, since they were involved in many cases where they did not provide assistance to people in distress. So my hopes are up. I see on the one hand the rule of law crisis that Robert and Erik mentioned, and on the other hand I see young people or civil society really getting involved in anti-racist protests and thoughts and try to educate themselves. So I think we have to capitalize on this and continue our work and question how much we, especially as white people, how much we perpetuate those systems and how we can change them probably. I know young people mostly can't change that much, but I think if we use a common voice, I think we can.
Would anyone else like to add anything to that question?
I can also echo what was said, but I have I think that young people can change everything. Actually, my criticism. Yeah, I think you are not right. Young people can change everything, and all people will leave the world soon, so they will not change so much anymore.
Maybe I have to correct. I meant we probably sometimes have the feeling we don't change enough, or we can't have an impact, but maybe the impact we have is less visible. Yeah, I'm completely okay with what Erik said. I agree completely.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an input that would provide any kind of positive way of ensuring we don't have any return to the status quo, but more of an observation from, say, the Aegean island perspective, which is actually, sadly, that I don't see the conversation happening here much at all. And there have really been just years of, it's not just human rights abuses, it's not just a failure of an asylum law, but on this local level, a kind of a building systemic and social racism that's really, really present and affects people's lives every single day. And there are behaviors of authorities and individuals in public spaces such as beaches, different ways of treating people within shops. It's so apparent, and yet not a conversation that's happening. Maybe because we do focus on human rights and we don't call out racism where we can, and also maybe there's not really an avenue to do that when individually speaking, it's whilst I live here and I've lived here for a long time, it's also to some extent not my community. So how we foster that conversation to happen more locally, where there is this huge mix of different nationalities present is a question I actually can't find an answer to, but believe we should ask a little bit more often.
Thank you so much. These are some really interesting answers. We've had quite a lot of questions come in, so we're not going to be able to get through them all, but I think we've got time for one more.
So another question came in about asking if the Turkish and Greek governments should they've used the term prosecuted for human rights violations, or if they should face any accountability. We talked quite a lot about accountability before, but if anyone else has anything to add specifically on that question.
I would like to add one point. Of course, as a lawyer, I'm completely in favor of enforcing accountability in any kind of human rights violation, but I don't necessarily think that Greece or Italy or Malta or any of those governments or nations that committed human rights abuses are actually the problem. I think this is a whole EU problem we are having, and by the Dublin system, we kind of push those problems towards the countries that have EU outer borders. But I don't think we can put the blame on, I think we shouldn't probably put the blame on Greece, for example, but rather realize how much of a pressure Greece is also under, which comes to the decongestion of the Aegean Islands as well, or Italy or Malta, and try to provide a European answer to this. And yeah, I think that would be what I would prefer. But of course, I'm in favor of bringing every human rights violation to a court.
So maybe on this, I didn't necessarily mean that the Greek or the Turkish or whoever government has to be taken or hold accountability, but the persons or the government's bodies, however you want to call it, responsible. So I broadly agree. I would maybe also raise that there are a lot of motivations coming from within the new Greek government to actively violate human rights violations that are, of course, governed somehow by the European migration policy, but still are like targeted efforts of the government itself. So for this, there has to be also a narrative and also a possibility to address it. But however, of course, it is important, and then it doesn't that much matter who is held accountable in the end, but someone has to be also for having a broader picture. So if, for example, the Greek government could be taken to the European Court of Human Rights for having killed people in March, this is obviously a human rights violation in many cases. At least the death wasn't investigated at all, also till now. This would not, of course, explicitly be holding accountable the Greek government, but implicitly, of course, also the European Union that had also was involved in this, obviously. So what I would say, holding someone accountable always means holding the policy accountable. And also saying, okay, this obviously is a human rights violation, saying this shouldn't happen again. The other point then is, of course, compliance. I mean, there was a judgment as early as in 2011, famous judgment called MSS, which was basically saying, okay, what you do today was illegal already in 2011, and this is a compliance issue then as well. So what can you reach with holding bodies responsible, accountable, but still from a human rights, from a rule of law perspective, this is a point. So you have to be granted the right, the remedy to go against what happens and to have it reviewed if it is legal or illegal.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, everyone. Sadly, we don't have time for any more questions. Thank you so much to everyone who sent them in, some really, really interesting ones, and thank you for engaging with the discussion at home. Thank you, of course, to each of our speakers for being with us here today on World Refugee Day. Thank you to Vera and Jacob and Ibrahim, Kirsty, Robert and Erik. Great stuff. Anyone who's watching this at home who wants to learn more about the topics covered here today, our panelists have done a brilliant job at answering everything really comprehensively in a short time period, but we've also put together a resource pack, which we'll post in the Facebook event for this and also on our various social media avenues after this, which is really great. So you can find out more.
Hello.
Hi, Ibrahim.
Yes, I just want to say something.
Sure.
Yes, I think we want to wrap up now, but I just want to say this, and the EU must also look at this thing that I'm trying to say now. You know, like we have a community representative in the camp, but now we don't have now because since the COVID-19, so everything does go down, right? And this thing, it's helping the communities. Like myself, I'm representing my community, and everybody know that we have different nationality here, both all the islands, We have the Cameroon, the Congo, the Ghana, the Senegal, the Afghanistan, the Arab, all those things. And when we have this community meeting representative, every week we have a meeting with the UNHCR, right? It helped a lot because now, for example, when I go to that meeting before, we are discussing some of the issues that are happening in my community. Like, for example, if my community want to protest, to strike, whatever, they will meet me as a community representative. They say, okay, Ibrahim, these are the things that we want to do. These are the things that we want to do. But when you go to that meeting, please inform these people that we want to do a protest. I say, okay, now you should hold on. When I go to the meeting, I will explain to the UNHCR head committee. So I will explain to them that these are the things that my community need. These are the things, these are the things. So they will give me feedback again. Okay, Ibrahim, when you go to your community, please explain to them that they should be patient. They should not strike. They should do this. So when I get back to my community, I will explain to them that don't strike, don't do this. So it's helping us. But now we don't have that kind of things. And as I'm talking to you now, I have some of my friends, they're always telling me that, oh, Ibrahim, we don't have a meeting again. Now we don't get no information about how the process of the asylum going on and this, blah, 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 blah. So if not, we want to do this, we want to do this. So please, I'm also appealing, please, you must act on this. I don't know if you people have any contract with the asylum Greek authority, because it's helping us greatly. When we have a meeting, we can be able to talk to our people. So anything that they want to do, we can be able to talk to them, which is good. So thank you very much. This is my concern.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for sharing that with us. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we'll have to wrap up here. If you're watching this at home, we invite you to join us at Europe Must Act, so join the collective voice, as Vera put it. We'd love to hear from you. You can find your local city chapter on Facebook, or if there isn't one, you could make your own. If you just go to Europe Must Act on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, we're everywhere. And you can see what we're up to on today on World Refugee Day as well. So that brings us to the end. We're going to end on a 2-minute video, which has been shared by some of our team who are based in Leros. They're asking for help as they see themselves faced with mass rejections of Syrian refugees. And after that video is played, then we will go offline. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us. Thank you again so much to our speakers and sharing your perspectives with us. This was great. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ali and I'm from Aleppo, Syria. And I'm 22 years old and I have been living in the refugee camp of Leros Island since 8 months. So now I don't want anybody to get upset with me because I'm not sitting here and I'm not crying. But I gotta put something a little bit respective so everybody adequately understands what's going on here in the refugee camp of Leros Island. So the issue began in 2020 after the Greek government changed the asylum system. They started to refuse all Syrian asylum seekers. They claim that Turkey is a safe country for them. So after you got dual rejection, for example, they might transport you to a closed camp. And unfortunately, they did it. They transported many people, including children, including disabled people. So as you already know, Turkey won't receive anyone back. So after that, Syrian community started to protest against the collective rejection. And recently, the Asylum Service, they give all the Syrian who carries open Ausweis or open card asylum without examination appeal. So how did you give who carries the closed one rejection despite he proved that Turkey is not a safe country for him? And 2 days ago, we had 3 suicide attempts. Actually, in fact, the Greek government works randomly. They don't know what they have to do. Believe me, I know some people, they really prove that Turkey is not a safe country for them, and they displayed some papers show that Turkey deported them from Turkey to Syria. But unfortunately, all of that just in vain, because the policy, no one can understand it. And I would like to apologize for being the messenger for this bad message.